Thank you for coming to our Filmmaker TalkBack. You're here for the other side of the aisle. Really fascinating subject, one that I am really interested in right now, and great lineup of filmmakers. I'd just like to ask that you turn off your cell phones. Please check, make sure that they are off. They always go, somebody buzzes, so we really appreciate that if you could take the time to do it now. Just a little heads up, we have so much going on at the festival. There's screenings right now, and many of our filmmakers do have screenings around 11:15, so some of them might get up. It's not that they're like frustrated with the topic and had enough, but they have to go run to their Q&As, which is great. And I actually, our moderator, who I'll introduce in a moment, Warren, has to leave as well. So around 11, he's gonna take off. And Daryl Pierce, our senior programmer, will take over and do a Q&A with the filmmakers that are here. So sorry for that disruption, but I think it'll all go smoothly. The filmmakers will introduce themselves in a moment, and I'd just like to introduce Warren. He is been with the festival for many years, leading some really amazing panels. He's such a pro. I think he's maybe conducted 2,500 interviews. Yeah, if you were here yesterday, you know he's extremely smart and knows his stuff. So without further ado, Warren, I'll let you take over, and thank you for coming.
The mic doesn't seem to want to go on. This one is? That one, thank you. I could work without it, but thank you for that introduction that I can't possibly live up to. That's wonderful. And I'd like to change it up. It is true that they have to leave to go to different screenings, but I like to think of this as a game of Survivor, and maybe we'll just be voted off one at a time. We'll see what happens. If you don't like the answers, they're out. That's sort of it. I will be leaving at 11 to go talk to Rogue Award winner Mark Monroe. I was not scheduled to do this panel, but I am really feel very lucky and honored, not only because of the people who are here on the panel, but also because AJ Schnack, who's the person who was going to lead this panel, is a good old friend of mine. And what I wanted to mention, I know the subject is dear to him, is that everybody knows AJ for his documentaries, but I first met AJ when I was curating the One Reel Film Festival up in Seattle, which is a celebration of short films. And AJ brought his very first film, which was not a documentary. It's shocking, isn't it? And it was a film called Might As Well Be Swing, which is really intriguing because it's about two couples who go away, one of which is a swinging couple, the other is possibly going to be lured into it. And even at that time, while there's a lot of comedy and a lot of scripted structure inherent in the piece, there's clearly some effort to start to break down that divide between fiction and nonfiction. And there's a little bit of documentary stuff going on in there. I'll let the actors tell you at some point, if you ever meet them, as to how much of that was real or not. But it gets a little saucy. So very lucky to be here. I would happily introduce all the panelists if I had seen all their films and could pronounce their names properly. But I'm going to let them do that because I've only seen two of the films. I'm sorry. I'm normally a preparation knucklehead. But we'll start to my left. Brett, will you take it away? Tell us who you are, what your film is, and truth, like it or not.
My name is Brett Weiner. I have a short film playing at the festival called Verbatim. And my film is it's a comedy about a court deposition where a lawyer and a government employee argue over what a photocopier is. And the script is word for word a real court deposition that I sort of did a comedic recreation of.
It's hilarious. My name is Julia Morrison. I'm the producer, writer, and editor of Hank and Asha, which is a romance, actually. And it takes place between a young man in New York and an Indian student who's studying abroad in Prague. And they start a correspondence by sending video letters back and forth to each other. So the whole film unfolds only through these video letters. That's all that you see subjectively told of their story. And my background is actually in documentary television, and I have produced historical reenactments. So if that comes up, there you go.
Hi, I'm Mike Tully. I made the narrative feature, Ping Pong Summer, and I guess according to this panel, how it's relevant is the intention was maybe what would happen if I inserted my sort of normal middle-class upbringing into an 80s movie that I grew up on. So if I combined my upbringing with the movies that I was watching at that age, what would happen? And I don't know. I still don't know. But I did make a documentary once.
My name is Ingrid Veninger. My film here at the festival is called The Animal Project. It's the first film I've actually done with professional actors. It's my 4th feature as a writer, director, producer, and I've primarily written roles for my family members, my children, my extended family in Slovakia. I am pro-truth, but under imaginary circumstances.
Well, I can't really go after that, yeah. My name is Suzan Beraza, and I'm here with a film called Uranium Drive-In, which is a documentary. And we had a film here, I think, 3 years ago called Bag It, and also a documentary. And as far as truth, I would say, what is the truth?
Hi, my name is Sara Dosa, and I'm one of the producers on Elena. And Elena is an autobiographical documentary that's basically about a sister's search for her own sister in the wake of great family tragedy. I'm a documentary director and producer as well. I'm not going to touch the truth question quite yet, so hopefully that'll come out through the panel.
Oh, yeah,
It's more awkward with just one. So, thank you. Julie, I'm going to start with you because you said dramatic reenactment almost with a sense of shame. Do you not cotton to that? Do you not think reenactments are a good thing?
Well, there are many flavors of reenactments, and the films that I've worked on that have included what are commonly thought of as documentary reenactments have been historical documentaries set in the 18th century. So you don't have any footage, and so you're telling a story visually, so what is there to do but a reenactment? And I think those types of reenactments often sort of get a bad name, you know, they can be a little cheesy with not, low production values and, not professional actors, and so in that context, I think a lot of people sometimes cringe when they think of a reenactment. But I saw Elena last night, which is a beautiful film, which includes reenactments of a completely different nature. So I think there's a broad range, and I'm proud of the reenactments that we did. And the sort of challenge in doing them is to try to do them differently. Is to try to not look like every History Channel documentary reenactment that you've seen, is to try to find creative ways of bringing them to life.
So, Sara, can you talk about those challenges?
Sure. There's tremendous challenges in terms of Elena. For those of you, has anyone here in the audience seen it? Okay, so not that many, but thank you for those of you who have. Briefly, Elena, it's a deeply personal film, and it's very much kind of an art film that combines, we call it, it's like a hybrid in a way, even though it's very much based on the experience of the director, Petra, who, it's kind of a spoiler alert, but the film is really about coming to terms with the loss of her sister, who tragically took her own life. But for Petra, the idea of enactment and reenactment really stems from the central idea that you must enact life in order to survive it in a way. Like, life can be so meaningless and violent and full of such pain that the only way to really come to grips with this kind of horror is to embody it. And so that's kind of the premise of the film in a way. And so it's hard to really go into detail without having the film behind me and expressing it, but I think that one of the greatest challenges for Petra in making this film was because she's exploring her sister's death, the worst thing that could have ever happened to her. She had to figure out a way to create life out of that. And so I'm trying to think. One of the ways that happened is she come back to me, because I'm just trying to think through some of the very specific moments in the film.
Well, I'm curious because there's a wonderful book Krista Paravini wrote about the loss of her twin sister, and her twin sister had always wanted to be a writer, and instead Krista, who was a photographer, took up the mantle essentially after her sister's unfortunate overdose to write out that whole thing. And she talks about how significant it is to sort of pay homage to her sister without making her an angel.
Yeah.
Is that something that you felt
Yeah,
as well?
definitely. I mean, part of this is it's like how do you represent life accurately especially when you take your own life? It's such a deeply personal issue that you have to kind of express someone in their full complexity in a way. I think with Elena, that's really the entire piece. And Petra doesn't call it reenactment, though, and I think that's really where this film is different. She really sees it as enactment. She's trying to become her sister in a way. She's not trying to recreate what happened. She's trying to bring new life to it, if that makes sense. And by doing that, finding meaning out of tremendous loss.
So there's some sense of capturing an essence rather than...
Exactly, yeah, very much so. And that by doing that, you can kind of reach a higher truth of who her sister was and how this experience resonated throughout their family.
Okay. Ingrid, I'll turn to you. Obviously, you have a more interesting family than I do, because I wouldn't cast them in anything. But but in this latest project, you're working with blurring lines again between what is true, not true, what is actually part of the project, what's not. Do any of those distinctions matter to you, or do you just plow ahead?
Sorry, can I just talk about the family thing for a second?
Oh, sure.
Because we came to Canada in 1968, and my father was in prison in former Czechoslovakia, and I'm an only child, and I didn't know my family at all in Slovakia. And the first time I went back, I was 17. And so we were going for a family holiday with my daughter, who was 17. I decided to make a film. And really, the film was trying to form a bridge. And the funny thing about it is, it kind of is a fairy tale movie where the family all love one another and everything. But it's such a fiction. And the interesting thing as a filmmaker for me was there were fascinating things happening in real life. But my family really laid down the line very firmly and said, our personal life, off limits. Your fiction, your script, we agree to. So that was a really, because I'm a fiction filmmaker, but I had this, it was a complete wall. So with my cousin and his gambling addiction, or like the divorces and all the stuff, like him in the basement, gambling like 24, impossible to shoot.
He didn't want that to come out to the public like it did just now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I speak about it Q&As all the time. And that's sort of being that blurry line where I'm inspired by the real, but I'm creating these imaginary circumstances, like if Michael and I were doing a scene, and more or less, I guess, in documentary, you start with where you are, how you're feeling in the moment, and we're going truthfully, and the camera's capturing what's actually happening. Well, I would want to throw in that you're going to come out as homosexual, and I'm pregnant. So I would layer that into the scene so that you're not just working from where you are, but you're working under sort of an imaginary thing that I concoct. And that's where the Animal Project came from, where I actually did a film with my son in a bunny suit when he was 8 years old, and he went out in the world and gave away free hugs. And I had a dream with 6 people in animal suits in a field. And then I decided that I wanted actors to commit to being in a film before they knew anything about the roles they were going to play. So I had this dream. I had the short film with my son in a bunny suit. And then I wanted actors. I met with 100 of them. I cast 8. I wanted them to agree to a 3-month shoot before they knew anything. And we met on the first day of production, which is the first scene in the film, and I gave them the script, and we were off.
Proof once again that actors will do just about anything. Just about. You want me to work? Sure. I'm there. But we share something which we just found out, is that I have a long history in a bunny suit too. I did over
I love
a year of stand-up comedy in a bunny suit in New York for no apparent reason. I just did my stand-up act in a bunny suit.
The best.
No idea why.
It's the best when there's no apparent reason.
That's right.
Right? It's when it's completely illogical and irrational, and you do it anyway.
Welcome to my life.
Yes.
So, we'll turn to you, Brett. Which is tough to follow the animals and not telling actors what they're doing. But you actually clearly had a script, but you saved money by not actually hiring a writer.
That's true. That's true.
Because writers demand so much. But how did you find that transcript? What brought you to that?
So somebody posted on Facebook a Wall Street Journal blog, which had a bunch of the transcript I ended up using as the script for the film. And I traced that back to an Ohio newspaper, because the court case took place in Ohio, and I traced that back to the Ohio Supreme Court website, where I downloaded the entire sort of 600-page case and read through it just to make sure the context was correct. And it was one of those things where when I was reading it, I was like quoting it out loud to myself, just thinking it was so funny it had to be a short film. And then, you know, from there on, it was sort of a matter of trying to just execute it. But it was interesting that I didn't have a writer, because there was nobody to tell me what was going on in that scene. You know, it was all, I had to sort of, I don't know if I was inventing or just interpreting what I felt was going on in that scene. And I think there was also something interesting that was said on the panel before about dramatic reenactments versus sort of dramatic enactments, I guess. Because I feel like my film, in a way, I was trying to say, sort of make a point about the legal system and about what's going on. And so it didn't really matter to me what the reality of the actual scene. Like, I didn't do any sort of research about finding tape or video of that actual scene that happened, because that wasn't my interest. I wasn't trying to recreate that. I was trying to sort of do something else and take the audience to a funny place while sort of trying to say something about the legal system.
Well, it's a really interesting thing, because you're working off the transcripts, and you actually were very diligent about it being precise.
Yeah. The title of the film is verbatim, so it literally had to be verbatim. So I had my script supervisor sit next to me, and I had her tug me on the sleeve whenever a word was wrong. So it would be a thing where somebody would say within instead of in, and she'd tug me on the sleeve, and I'd be like, we have to do that again. And so some actors were better than others at knowing their lines during the day.
Just borrow some from Ingrid. They'll do anything. It's fine. But I'm curious about the transcript thing, because if you've ever watched the presidential debates and thought, oh my God, is this the choice? No. If you ever watch them versus reading them the next day in transcript form, there's a big difference between reading the words and actually hearing and seeing, hearing the intonation and seeing them. So you just
Absolutely. Yeah, I just took off. And I think it probably was not as sort of, I brought it to sort of a frenzied place at the end. And I think probably in the actual reality of it was probably a little bit more boring, I guess. But the subtext of what the characters were feeling at that time, I think, was pretty clear, at least to me. So I just took those emotions and sort of ran with them. Although one of the lawyers is really angry in it, and in reading the rest of the depositions, there were moments in it where, other lawyers were like, "Can you please stop yelling? You're hurting my ears." And he'd be like, "Get outside if I'm hurting your ears, then don't." So there was a level of anger that I think I did tap into that was honest. So
that was honest.
Yeah.
Do you have to get permission to use
Right.
No, it is a publicly available document. It's a matter of public record, filed with the Supreme Court of Ohio.
Some studios thinking we're going to get a first look deal right now with all courts in California. So I'm like, we want that material. Have you gone back and shown it to the people who were involved?
No.
No?
No way. Because my understanding is that people can sue you just because. And they're a bunch of lawyers. So I don't want to court that. You know what I mean?
Oh, I'm going to have some fun after this event. So, Suzanne, I'll turn to you. Your wonderful documentary, Uranium Drive-In, one of the two I saw, so I'm very excited about this, is a more traditional in its approach to things. Did you ever wish that you could actually fudge some things and get into a more fictional component?
Yeah, I mean, the film, when we were going into the film, we were like, okay, we're going to make this film subjective, which is what people don't usually say when you're making a documentary. So I really wanted the film to be less of an essay-style film. Like, you learn nothing about uranium, really, except being extremely confused as to whether or not these things are safe or not. But more that I found it fascinating to really look at these characters and examine what their versions of the truth is. And they can be polar opposites from one character to the next. But I found that was fascinating, because we always are searching for the truth, but we really have no idea what that is. I mean, we have reports, we have studies, we have research, but it's very difficult to really know where that lies. So I decided just to push that completely out of the film and let it be a very gray area as to where the truth really is. As far as sometimes wanting to bend the truth, when you're, months and months, or years into a project and nothing's happening, like you're waiting for a decision to be made so that you have an ending to your damn film, and nothing's happening, and you feel extremely frustrated, like, can't something just happen? Yes, I really wanted to make something happen, and it can be highly, that's why I think where documentaries sometimes are just a frigging trip, because you just have no idea where it's going to go. You're going down this road, and it can take a sharp left turn, and maybe you better go that way because straight ahead is probably a dead end.
Well, it's interesting because docs do have to take on an organic quality if you're actually tracking them as you're going along. So how do you know when you're done? I mean, there are times in the film where you feel the frustration of those people, like, let's make a decision.
Yeah. How to know when you're done? I mean, I guess when you just can't stand it anymore.
It's not artistic, it's just a patience thing.
I mean, I've had people say, like, oh, don't you watch your film? And I'm like, are you kidding? I edited that damn film for 9 months. I'm not watching this damn film, but I'm so happy that you are. But that's very tricky. Like, you really have to think of alternative ideas of what could feel satisfying to an audience for an ending, and we went through many different ideas of what, because you don't want it just to be a total bummer at the end where they're just like, well, that was a stupid ending. I mean, so it's like, I feel like documentary filmmakers are being pushed more and more to make their films like narrative films with very nice, satisfying 3-act structure and a really great climax and a super satisfying ending, and sometimes it's just really difficult to make that happen.
Right. Well, there is something, I mean, you see a documentary like Man on Wire or something, and it plays like Ocean's 11 or something. It's pretty dynamic. But you feel like you can sort of ignore the 3-act structure and just follow it to where it doesn't end?
It seems, if you want to get traditional funding, like grants, unless you're just independently wealthy, it seems more and more like you have to have some kind of 3-act structure. At least that's what I'm finding, and I'd be curious to see if other people feel the same. But people who are giving decent funding, big grant organizations, are expecting more and more that you have it kind of wrapped up into a neat little package.
Since you brought up the word funding, which I normally stay away from, I'm just curious, Ingrid, you had a script that you didn't show to your cast. How did you arrange financing for that?
Well, like with all my films, I pretty much pay for production myself. So I paid for the production of the Animal Project, and then was going to do an Indiegogo, which is so much work, Kickstarter you have. So instead, I just put on Facebook that I was looking for 4 Canadians to contribute $5,000 each in exchange for an executive producer credit, and I gave a 5-day window, and I got the 20 grand in 5 days. So that saved me about 6 months of work.
Wow. Once again, everybody moved to Canada. That's clearly the message. Now, Michael, I'm sorry. It's now your turn here.
I'd quickly, if I can, based on what you just said, I think there's a really big difference in even the starting point for a filmmaker, whether it's narrative, but especially doc. And I think there are a lot of people, maybe my instincts align to the people who say, I don't know where this movie's headed, and then the grant is like, you have to present exactly where your movie's headed. It's like writing an essay, and you have to have your thesis worked out. And I think the more interesting cinema comes from when you're not sure what's going to happen, and that's when the film, you can sense it when you're watching a movie that they're finding it as it's going along. But there is such an ingrained sense where, especially when it comes to the grant process, that you're pretty much supposed to present them the movie. You could like even storyboard it, and then it's like, well, the whole point of nonfiction is to discover it as we're going.
Well, when I'm teaching screenwriting, I tell writers that all the time, that I like a script that doesn't have the 3rd act plotted out, because I want to feel like we're going to discover something in the process. But for you, was it that open-ended, or you had it scripted, didn't you?
For Ping Pong Summer, we did, and I mean, the last movie I'd made, Septien, the whole point was to throw a few different genres in a blender, and we're talking narrative here, but I was like, what if you put sports into a Southern Gothic movie, and then you had the Spirit of the Beehive, a weird Spanish film. Like, what would that look like? You know, and it was a total risk. And I put that on my credit card and had a friend who invested, and we like got into Sundance, and it sort of paid itself off. So that risk ended up being a reward. But for this one, its inspirations are a 3-act structure movie. So inherently, if you're going to be honest to an 80s movie, all those generic elements are in there. So it's sort of riding a line between when you're trying to put your own spin on it. But like in our movie, without giving a spoiler, I guess, is there, if anyone is going to see it later today or eventually, you know, right when you're in the traditional Hollywood movie, when you're supposed to have like, I gotta win this match, or like, my life is over. Like in our movie, the dad's like, we'll love you even if you lose, son. You know, it's just like, that's the most undramatic thing you're supposed to do. You totally undercut the drama of the moment. And all of those things I wanted to do. So it's like, whether it works for a person or whether they recognize that as being a conscious choice. But yeah, so when you're working with the formula, you had to sort of obey it in some regards. But then little things like that, I thought it would be fun to subvert it, hopefully. And that's up to you guys to decide.
Julie, as a writer and an editor, are you cognizant of formula within the process?
So our film was actually started as a 30-page outline. The two characters are self-recording these video letters that they're sending back and forth, and we felt that in order for it to feel authentic, that we couldn't script it too much, or the premise was going to sort of fall apart. And some people have actually told us that they wondered watching our film whether or not it was a documentary. And so, if you've seen the film, that may not seem so plausible, but we did a lot of collaboration with the actors, and so they worked from this outline, but all of the dialogue came from them. So we then had a lot of material. A lot more material than you might have in a project like this, and we strung it all together, and our first cut was 2 hours and 45 minutes long. So then the edit became where we completely restructured and shaped the story and found the moments in all of this material that felt the most truthful, that felt like they were connecting to each other to shape this story again.
That
So a
feels
lot
more like a
changed,
doc
actually.
process.
Yeah, the edit of it was a lot like a documentary. The scenes are only one person on camera at a time talking to the camera. So typically when you shoot a narrative film, you shoot what's called coverage. So you shoot a master shot and then a close-up of one person, a close-up of the other. And so there's a lot of time involved in that process. But for our film, each scene we could just shoot. You know, it was just the character talking to the camera, and then we could do it again, a different way, and again, a different way. And so, so that gave us so many options, and all of these sort of modular pieces that could go sort of anywhere in the story if we could make it feel like they led one to the next.
One of the big differences in editing down a feature versus a doc would be the ratio of footage you have. How much footage did you shoot for something like this, which is so unusual?
That's a good question. A lot.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how many hours. We shot for 22 days, and we didn't have a lot of times when you shoot a film, a lot of the day is eaten up by relighting and recostuming and all of these things. But if it's just you're working with one actor all day long, you can get a lot of material. So we had a lot. We edited for 6 months, which is unusual for a project like ours. A documentary often takes a year to edit because you have so much material, but so yeah, we were sort of somewhere in between.
Fascinating. There's somebody else on the panel who's worked with their family, not just Ingrid. Brett, do you want to talk about your parents' gambling problem?
Sure. No gambling problem. Okay. But I brought this up beforehand because I thought it might be relevant to this. I did a web series called The Parent Project where I would call my mom and record her and ask for an idea for a story, and then I'd make whatever she said. So it was one of those things where I'd be like, well, so Mom, tell me a story, and then I'll film it. So it cuts between me sort of dramatizing her story and us sort of just chatting. And it's one of those weird things that I think is a thing I'm sort of finding in my work, that I'm trying to dig down to whatever the most honest thing is and make something funny based off that. So that was my little project I did with my family.
Be proud of it. But it's an interesting thing when you get into this realm. Is there something that becomes? I always think that the more specific you are to your emotional truth, the more universal it becomes. Do you feel like your stuff with your parents crossed that?
Yeah, and what would happen was the way that show worked is the conversations were all just recording with text, so people who watched it wouldn't sort of see my mom. And there was this thing in Los Angeles called Channel 101, which is a monthly screening of short little web series things. And so I would play it there. And so the audience would come up to me after and say things like, "Oh, your mom sounds exactly like my mom. Like, what is that?" You know, like they would put that on there. So there was something about, my mom's very specific, but just having that filtered phone voice, I think, was something that everybody sort of would like and get along with. Also, a lot of stuff I'd leave in is the second episode was her talking a lot about how she didn't like the first episode. And we do a lot of stuff like that, and she'd comment on like my other work and how she didn't like it, and you know, things like that. So, and I think the funniest moments were those honest moments where, you know, I'm like, "What are you talking about, Mom?" And she's like, "I'm just explaining it to you." Or like me explaining to my mom what a hipster was, because she didn't understand what that was.
So it's already a meta project that your mom took to another level of meta.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
It's pretty impressive. Sarah, you seem like you've been taking notes, and are you ready to respond to the rest of your questions?
Yeah, it's been a great process. No, I was just, it's been a similar thing with Elena, even though Elena's not a funny movie. There's, moments of levity in it, but it's a very emotional film. But it's that, it's based on a family story, but it's this very personal, small story in a way, but because it approximates this emotional truth, it has like this universal appeal. And it's been amazing actually watching people come forth after seeing it, because, they've never met Petra, the director, except there's something in this film, because it's so intimate, that it feels like it's their own truth as well. People share their stories of loss, and through that there's like a sense of like a community coming together over what to many people feel like such an isolating experience. So just to share, I think that when we do mine, whether it's our family stories or kind of our deepest emotional truths, I think that we can really reach audiences in quite a powerful way.
Well, I have a question, and it can be for you or for Brett, anybody. Like, I directed or brought in as a consultant on a one-woman show years ago, where the person wanted feedback, and I was like, okay, and put up a scene. I was like, "Oh my God, your blocking is insane. It's so clumsy." And I said, "If we just move the table over here, put the door over there, and all this stuff." She said, "But that's not the way it was." And it turned out that the whole play had become her own personal psychodrama. And good thing she was a working therapist in New York. But in any of these projects, how do you manage to not be indulgent and yet be honest?
That was a huge issue on Elena, actually, because it is such a deeply personal story. Petra, the director, ended up working with a screenwriter, and the editorial process took about 3 years. So it was like constantly going back and forth of, expressing what felt to her like a very real experience, but at the same time working with the screenwriter to help really draw out these more narrative elements, which were still true and nonfiction, but helped to bring like that sense of tying a story together. And I think that process of kind of oscillating between the inside and the outside was essential in actually crafting a coherent story. So it was key. That kind of back and forth was really key in terms of developing the film.
And Suzanne, I'll go back to you. I mean, it's fascinating when you're following people. Brett mentioned that his mom was already critical in episode 2, right? You're following these folks for quite a while, and you want to tell their story. And even though you admit to being subjective, did you find that they wanted to have some input on how they were presented, or that they started to edit their performances as they were?
A little bit. I think as soon as people know that, and it changed over time. So the first time we filmed Angel, and when I had met her, she kind of looked like you would expect a mother in a very poor town to look. And then when we showed up for our first day of shooting, she'd put on makeup, and she'd made sure her hair looked good. And I was like, oh crap, that's not what I wanted at all. I wanted her. So a lot of that first day, we just couldn't use her on camera because she'd kind of dolled up too much. But once she got used to us,
What did you tell her? Like trailer trash it up a little bit? You have a Y in your name, for God's sakes. It's
I was a little more subtle than that, but hopefully. We just would surprise her, knock on the door, hey, we're here. No, but over time, I think when it really, to me, becomes exciting is when people just start to forget you're there completely, and you really start to get this sense that, so further along in the process, it was like, oh, they're here again, okay, whatever, we've got a lot to do today, and it's like, great, we'll just come along. And I think that's when it starts to really feel much better for me, and a lot more like you're really getting verite is when you've become so much a part of their lives that they just don't even notice you're there. And so, yeah.
Is that just time, or is there a certain intimacy? Are there like sort of secrets to how to build up that intimacy?
I think part of it is time, and part of it, some people you'll just never get it, like they're just so self-conscious. And for fiction film, that they say like, I don't know what, 80% is the casting. And I feel like a lot of that is even in documentaries. Like, you have to make sure you get the right people, because some people just never will let their guard down. Like, it just won't happen. You'll try and you'll try. So it's really that first time you meet them, kind of seeing how far they're willing to go and how deep they'll go. And people have been like, why did you use 3 women in a film about uranium mining? And it's like, well, and I didn't even notice that I had done that, but I think it was because these were 3 women who were willing to expose themselves to a whole nother level, and to a place where it becomes emotional and interesting. While I have to say that most of the guys were just very much like not letting me get deep at all.
The miners wouldn't let you go deep. Interesting.
That sounded bad, sorry.
I'm sorry, it was hanging out there. I apologize. I'm sorry. It was just.
Hey, you're a comedian, you got to jump on those.
No, I don't have a rabbit suit on. I'm not a comedian anymore.
Well, I've been really, as a fiction filmmaker, I've been really influenced by a documentary filmmaker who you may or may not know. His name is Peter Mettler, and I've produced his films for the last 20 years. He made Gambling Gods and LSD, recently a film called The End of Time. And as a result, my fictions are with a crew of 2, camera, sound, my daughter, and sort of an all-rounder is the maximum, so between 2 and 4 people and myself. And what's interesting is, I guess after each film, there's always, a question about what is real, what was improvised. In program notes, it's usually always the paragraph starts with partially improvised, and I don't really want to, and people really want to know what was accidental, what was planned. And it's actually not interesting for me to talk about, because it's the arbitrariness, it's the ambiguity of that is part of what makes it alive. And that question is part of the soul of the film, and I don't want to define it because it dilutes it, it reduces. So, and I think it maybe stems from I'm not being so interested in the truth. I mean, being an actor, I'm constantly sort of in this perpetual mask world. And I remember my very first job when I was 8 years old. I think I was convinced by the game when my brother, this incredible actor that was playing my brother, was hugging me and loving me. And when the camera stopped rolling, he became a completely different person. And very quickly, at the age of 8, I was like, oh, I see. That was pretend. And, so that blurring is something that I never really want to completely articulate for myself and in my work.
It sounds very much like the Dennis Potter idea that reality is less significant than non-reality, which reminds us of the shreds of our own sovereignty, which I love that notion. That's the way we actually experience the world, is in a non-real way. Michael, I want to go back to you for a second, and then it ties into this documentary intimacy, trust question, is that in shooting a narrative, there's a lot of artifice, obviously. And yet, one of the things about Ping Pong Summer that worked for me is that it felt real enough to actually be a painful reminder of my childhood. So thank you for that.
Nerd.
That's right. Like that wasn't obvious. But how do you do that with your actors? How do you make them feel comfortable enough to bring out those elements? Like, you were going to just look like a fool for a while. Put on those parachute pants.
Yeah, I mean, the kid who plays Teddy, the friend who has these Jerry curls and these Arthur Ashe shorts, where he was like, he was the one who really had to be the most different. And we have our movie has actors like Susan Sarandon and Leah Thompson and these professional actors who've been doing it forever. And then the kids I didn't want to ship in actors from New York or LA. I feel like there are talented people everywhere, so we did open calls, not even for actors, it was just kids we wanted to put on tape. And he was the one, he showed up in the library where we were in Urbana, Maryland, near where my parents still live, where I'm from. And he wasn't even there for the audition. His mom told him to go get a book. So he didn't even want to go to the library. And then my wife saw him and was like, that kid looks kind of like, and we brought him in and he sort of had a Maryland accent, which is an accent, I don't know if you know it, you can't imitate it. Like Leah Thompson tried to learn it and was like, I don't know what that is. So that was the one that was more of a stretch and sort of coaching a performance to get him to be this character. And then you just sort of, luckily I think we just create an atmosphere on set. It's really important to me. I do not believe in like everyone feeling like you're gonna get fired or you're gonna get yelled at will make you work better. I just don't believe that. So I think to that extent, it was just creating an atmosphere where everyone was loose enough to be able to feel free. And the crew was really great. We bonded with the cast and crew. So I think the kids maybe had less of a chip about like being too cool, and he's wearing these short shorts, and I made him do this little waddle walk, which he was just like, are you really making me do this right now? But then again, by a week into it, they had fun. It was like their job. It's like they were eating ice cream and funnel cakes and riding the slip and slide and stuff. It was like it probably couldn't have been a more fun role for those kids.
There you go. So those were the perks.
Yeah.
No
I think,
pay.
and one thing I'd say really quickly to your point about the line between what really happened and didn't, so I'm inserting my own life, and it was I've been trying to make this movie for 20 years, like I had the idea when I was a senior in high school, and which is really embarrassing to say, but it's true. But then there's also the artificial movie elements. But when it was like a month before we were shooting, and my mom said, "You remember Dad that summer he took us?" And I had 3 older sisters, so it was 4 of us that would be in one car going to vacation. But when you're making a low-budget movie, it was like there will be 1 sister, there will not be 3 sisters. So I kind of combined all the worst, funniest elements into 1 sister. But my mom was like, "You remember when Dad took the police car?" My dad was a state trooper. He is from Ireland, so those elements that are, that's very true. John Hannah wears his police uniform, his actual. But my mom was like, "You remember when Dad took the police car to save on a tank of gas?" So he didn't get clearance officially, I don't think. And my wife is like, "Dude, you're making a comedy and you don't have the family taking the police car on vacation? Like, I don't know if you should be making this movie." So that's where we incorporated the personal, where it's like, this is borderline too artificial. Like, so in the movie, someone will be like, "Oh, that's too ridiculous," but that happened, and it's also you're making a goofy comedy. So yeah, the line is really blurry, and I think it comes down to instinct and just trusting your gut.
Your mom and my mom should hang out.
It sounds like they would get along really well, I think, yeah.
Like an older version of Two Broke Girls or something like that. It'll be fantastic. Take the world by storm. But I'm fascinated because when you started off this panel, you made it sound like you were, I'm just inserting my style into a genre piece from the 80s comic, but it's actually semi-autobiographical.
I describe it as personal versus autobiographical. Mm-hmm. So yes, I used to smell my cassette tapes when I would buy them from the store. Right. I used to know, I used to listen to rap music. So a lot of those things I thought, and then also another great point of being specific becomes more universal. When I was younger, I used to really think that, for the 20 years I was writing this, every winter I'd be like, "I'm making Ping Pong Summer next year." And at one point I was like, I can't call it Ocean City, Maryland. It's Watertown. I was like, what could be more generic than the words ocean and city? So I was trying to get away from it. And then I lived long enough and realized, no, actually, the more personal we are, the more it'll extend to people who are watching it. So we played in Holland and had this 900-seat theater to a bunch of somewhat stiff Dutch people, and it's just how is this going to go? Is this going to play like a foreign film from another planet? And it seemed to go well, and people related to it. So I do think there's something to be said for the more specific you are, the more universal the film will be. And that's a tough one to figure out, I think. It took me a while to realize that.
Now, I'm fascinated. 20 years it took you? I mean, you could have asked 5
I mean, I have the idea. I have a high school friend, Jen, who's here. I was at Linganore High School in Frederick, Maryland, and I had the idea in Spanish class in the spring of 1992. And then I went to college, and I got out in 1997, and every year I was like, I'm making it next summer, I'm making it next summer. And now it's 2014.
But what was the obstacle?
Well, to make a legitimate feeling movie. You know, the last movie I made was $30,000. We shot it on film, but it was more contained. And this movie, we had to get clearances. I really wanted to have music from the era, because I feel like when you're making a low-budget movie and you can't get the clearance, automatically, like my parents who don't watch movies would be like, this feels kind of like a real movie, but not really, and I don't know why. And it's like, because that's not Bobby Vinton. It's my buddy who made a sort of Bobby Vinton song in the background. So it was like really important that we shoot on film and we have, you know, have some familiar names, but the credibility of the production value, I think, to do that on a micro-budget scale. And we were still low seven figures, so for me it was way more money than I'd ever worked with, but we were still making a $5 million movie for low seven figures. But those things, I think, like, to make it, we needed Fat Boys Stickum to be the opening credits, and, you know, that, I think, goes a long way to making the movie feel bigger and more real than otherwise. And it's just like, we're, you know, the odds are stacked against us as independent filmmakers for those sorts of awful reasons. And even getting clearances, like to get the Nike branding, that wasn't product placement. It was like really important to have that Nike pop top, because it spoke of sort of, back then, that was like a really big deal. So it wasn't like having in the Brad Pitt movie putting Frosted Flakes at the table for no reason whatsoever. It was a plot point. So when we got those elements and Nike signed off, it made it feel like a, you know, more of a real, bigger movie.
I think it's interesting because the technology now has allowed a lot of filmmakers to make micro-budget films. And I think when a micro-budget filmmaker tries to make a big Hollywood-feeling film, like, that's where the problem, you know, that's when it starts to not feel like it's working quite right. But at the same time, this technology also allows filmmakers to make much smaller, sort of micro-budget appropriate films that have a whole other sense of authenticity to them because they're small. So like Ingrid mentioned, our film also, bye.
I really didn't think she'd be the first to go, but there you go.
So our film, we also spoke about our crew as a documentary style crew, because it was, we were working with a DSLR camera. We only had, you know, the director, the camera operator, a sound person, and maybe one or two other people around at any time. And for our film, for the premise of our film, which is very small and sort of by design a micro-budget premise, we were able to make a film for a very low budget that did feel real because it wasn't trying to be something else, if that makes sense.
I'm curious if the rest of you can talk about this idea of financial constraints. I mean, Michael and Julie have covered that, but sometimes they can be beneficial, can't they, to the process?
Yeah, I think that they really can. Elena is a different story, but a film I just finished directing, it was an incredibly tight budget, but there was things that we had to, it's like that scarcity brings together community. You know, everyone's trying to scrap together to see, okay, well, we don't have budget for, you know, a camera, so who has a camera? Oh, it turns out this camera is going to be really great for our production needs. There's a way that I think that, especially in independent film, people just want to rally around and help each other. And so I think that that can be a plus. And then once you have all these people together, you can, it's almost like, reminds me of like Captain Planet or something. It's like our powers can combine, and you can like tap into these different skill sets that you wouldn't have had before, because you have to come together. You have to work in this collaborative way. So I think that if you're open to it and see like an obstacle instead as just a stepping stone to the next phase, it can really kind of force you into creative thinking.
That energy is great, but does it do something to bring out a little more truth? Is there something about that spirit that helps you on set?
I think truth is like, it's complicated. I would say perhaps it's a myriad of truths, you know, that everyone's bringing. When you have to work together, you're going to have many, many voices in the room, and you're going to have a lot of opinions. And so something that, you know, I might think like, yes, this is exactly how this scene should be shot, but because I have like, you know, 5 other teammates who are all, you know, quite vocal, then the idea of my truth or my vision for the film is going to be different because I have many, many voices to contend with. And that could ultimately lead to create something much stronger because there's this collaborative process that comes into play. So I would say that's kind of yeah, how it's played out in some circumstances. But just one point to kind of what Michael was saying about like this creating this authentic feel. I think it's interesting in terms of finances because there's something about a high production value that creates legitimacy of a film, and I think it's both interesting and also problematic. For Elena, it's like, you know, again, this very personal story, and there's kind of a stigma about personal stories. You know, everyone wants to mind their own families for their stories. Sometimes that can be beautiful and meaningful. Sometimes it can feel like you're in someone's diary in a way that's a bit uncomfortable. So there's definitely a stigma. But I think there is something about a very high, making it very cinematic, making it really big, that comes into whether you're shooting on a red, which is what we did in some scenes in Elena, that can elevate the film. And that's something people really respond to. They always talk about the beauty of the film. But I think it raises some complicated questions, like, do we need to have big budgets to create something that feels more, you know, universal and accessible? So.
It's a good question. But I'm going to open it up to you guys for questions. Yes, sir.
Just a little technical question for Brett. I didn't understand how your mother's voice was done. Was it text?
Yeah, it was, I would record our phone conversation, and then in the show, it would be played, the audio recording would be played, and then I'd put in text of whatever we said, kind of like subtitles almost, so you could understand, because sometimes on the phone connections, it was a little bit tough to understand the actual words. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question? No. Black screen with text, via recording of the conversation. We can talk about it after, if it's still sense.
Could you do anything to make my mom more lucid on the phone? Yes. Right.
Following up on what you said about high production values creating legitimacy, for the documentary filmmakers, do you think that's true too? There's certainly been a trend, you know, from years ago, documentaries could have been shot on, you know, home movies and it didn't matter. Now, that's not, I feel it's not really true.
Well, I have to go in just 1 minute, but I would just say the most important thing, even above high production values, is your story. I mean, I've seen things that look like crap, like shot on I don't know what, and also audio. Audio is extremely important. If you don't have good audio, people get extremely frustrated, and they don't even know why they're frustrated. They just can't. Bad audio is a kiss of death. So if you're spending money on anything, make sure you have great audio, decent camera, wonderful story. That's my quick final 2 cents.
There we go. Thank you, Suzanne. Uranium Drive-In. You can hear the whole movie, and it also looks beautiful. Honestly, it really does look gorgeous. So, Suzanne. So that's just got a TV deal. She just announced. Say that with pride. Round of applause. There we go. Is that Jeff? Yes. All right, sir. Anybody?
Really quickly, the documentary I made was called Silver Jew. It was about this poet and musician, David Berman, of a band, the Silver Jews. And we followed him he had never toured, and he put records out, and he went to Israel, and he had hit rock bottom and was having this sort of reawakening. And he had a moment at the Wailing Wall, and it was a really spiritual moment, and he broke down, and I had this thought, and I was filming it, and, you know, I'm like, this is the movie. Bye.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I just want to walk out in a huff or something like that. Enough!
You're off the island. Get out of here, pal. But so I had that first question immediately. My human instinct was not, oh my God, now we have a movie. It was like, I need to not be here right now with the camera. But then I sort of balanced it, and my reconciliation was like, I'm not going to do the Diane Sawyer zoom into snot as close as possible. So I tried to maintain a respectful distance where I was there, but I was also back. And that was also just sort of all these things were happening in the moment. But yeah, it was that thought of like, well, man, I came over here. I have a camera. He's open to it. It's like, I have to be doing this. But my first instinct was not like, awesome. It was sort of like, I need to let you have your moment here, buddy.
I think we had another one right over here.
Sure. You could, You can watch it. It's on YouTube. It's called The Parent Project if you look it up. So, you know, I'll do the one sentence thing so there's more, so people can get more questions. But like the first thing she came up with was, you know, a daughter steals the minivan of her parents and goes joyriding at night. And then she stopped and restarted and said, actually, it's about the parents who are fretting over the daughter who stole the minivan. So then it sort of cuts from the daughter to the parents. And that's sort of an example. But if you look up The Parent Project, you can see a bunch of those episodes on YouTube.
Okay, right down here.
So, Michael, how do you get Susan Sarandon and Leah Thompson in a low-budget film?
I don't know. I don't know how that happened. Susan was the first commitment, and she had. She's a co-owner of a ping pong club, a franchise now that's spreading called Spin that started in New York, and then they have one in LA, and I think San Francisco. They're sort of opening. So we thought that would be an interesting in to have a female Mr. Miyagi character, make it a female as opposed to it's always the grizzled alcoholic guy. And it just seemed like, you know, who's won an Oscar and co-owns a ping pong club, which isn't to say she's going to do it. But so, yeah, we just reached out to her, and it was actually her partner, business partner in the project, Jonathan Bricklin, who's sort of the voice of Spin. He read the script, and he called me, and that was like one of the best calls I'd ever gotten. He was just like, it was kind of out of the blue. But it was a recommendation from a filmmaker friend, Jay Duplass. Jay and Mark are brothers, and they direct movies and do all sorts of stuff. But they made a movie with Susan called Jeff Who Lives at Home. So I reached out to Jay, who I'm friendly with, and was like, is she nice to work with Susan? Because I'm thinking about reaching out to her because I'd rather make a bad movie with nice people than an awesome movie with awful people. I think you can do both. But he vouched for her. He said she was really cool, and then he wrote her an email, and he had read the script and was like, this is pretty cool. So she sort of has gone on record saying, like, you know, imagine how many scripts she gets sent to her, projects, and just by having the one degree of someone she had worked with who she trusted, that proved to be I would say that's like the ultimate key. And then she watched my last weird movie and actually sort of vibed on the sense of humor, which not many people do. So that's when I think, and we met, and I think she realized that, like, yeah, this is a personal project and he seems to know what he's doing. But it was really having that one window in. If we had just cold called her agent, I don't think it would have gotten to her, which is sort of maybe depressing to think about, having that.
I'm so glad she said yes, because I was trying to think of another name actor who has ping pong parlor that you could find, you know. Maybe you know.
Yeah, I mean,
more
we
than I
tried
do.
for months. We were, on the ground research, and it just kept going right back to there. Yeah. Wait, oh yeah, we should.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So in reading the whole deposition, the person being interviewed, I think, is a sort of a lethal combination of nervous, poorly coached, and kind of dumb. And so I had him play all those three things at different times. And reading the rest of the deposition, it was very clear. And he even says later in the deposition, it's not in the film because it's a little bit further away, and it didn't really make sense to put it in. But he said, you know, I'm just nervous that you're going to take something I say and use it against me, because probably he watched too many like CSIs or something, and is like, you know, because that's what his point of reference is for this sort of thing, when it's just he's such a tangential character in the whole court case. So yes, so I had him play it nervous, and then sometimes you see him looking at his document and he's reading things off it, and then sometimes he just clearly doesn't understand it.
Go ahead, Brooke.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a huge question, which I'm sure I and every filmmaker will be figuring out throughout their life. Yeah, it's really hard, especially with documentary, which is the medium I work in, because you are always wrestling. There's so many ways to tell a story, and especially in the editorial process, when you have, you know, hundreds of hours of footage. You could put it together in so many different ways. So for me personally, one thing that was really helpful was just going back to my production notes and just really thinking through. And I should just clarify, this is not Elena, this is a different film I directed, which is about 2 former soldiers whose lives come together actually in the Oregon woods through the wild mushroom hunting trade. But for me, it was really looking at my first impressions. You know, like what drew me to these characters, what drew me to this world, and going back to that and feeling anchored in my first, kind of my gut and my instinct. But then also, you know, casting a much wider net and what moved me in terms of other films, you know, thinking of things like, oh, I love this film, this really works here. For example, I don't know if anyone saw Rich Hill, but I saw it yesterday and I just thought it was a phenomenally beautiful film. And I know it's one that I'm gonna call upon in future films that I work on because I just love the way it's edited. So I think it's like that process of going from the very personal and what you respond to in your specific locations and then just gobbling up inspiration. And then it's really, I think it's a really fun process to engage. Like I had this wonderfully opinionated editor and she and I really shared a lot of sensibilities, weirdly so, but then the points where we would disagree, it's like this interrogation that ended up creating something I think stronger. But I think just as long as you gotta stick to your guns and the things that motivate you to making a film, it's so hard, you know, that you have to, there has to be that passion that like you hold on to. And I think if you just can return to that and tap into that, it'll help you, you know, figure out what that vision really is, I guess. But it's a huge question.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think it's also when we're talking about 80% is casting the subjects, I think 90% is who you agree that you're working with before you even make your movie. I've had friends who've had nightmarish experiences and just sort of like, did these producers watch the last movie this director made or read the script? Like, what are these conversations happening for? Because they're totally, and that all stems from who you're aligning yourself with. So I think a lot of those sort of nightmarish scenarios happen from the very beginning before you've even started. So trusting who you're working with, having a similar taste bud, that stuff.
So I actually made my film with my husband, and we shot the film 6 months after we got married. But I think there's a sort of a metaphor in there that when you're putting together a team for your film, it is a sort of family dynamic, you know, and who you, like you said, like who you choose to collaborate with. It's like looking for a partner, or and my husband and I would end up in these same, you know, situations, right? And we're navigating our new marriage, you know, and all these things, and we're living abroad, and we, you know, we struggled with it for a little while, but then we sort of like remembered that we were, you know, collaborators in the same way you would be in any sort of professional situation. And the answer that we would always come back to in those situations was, let's just try it. You know, so we'd end up arguing about something, and there wasn't going to be any way to solve it until we just tried it. So we try it, and sometimes my way was right, and sometimes his way was right, you know, and you sort of navigate through that. So I think in any sort of project, it's also sort of finding the language of your group and sort of finding the way to get through those knotty bits, and then you sort of come back to that as you've figured it out.
It might be interesting to come back and talk to you about this in 6 years or 7 years, and collaborating.
We're still happily married.
That's really great. Go ahead.
I'm curious on both sides of the aisle, for those of you who've seen the Sara film, Stories We Tell, and I'm really curious to get your impression or your sensibility of what she did with her recreations that weren't recreations, or that you don't know actually what is and what isn't real in that film, and what you felt about that. Thanks for the shout out.
I would also bring up Matt Wolf's Teenage, which is actually in theaters now. Yeah, I don't know what the difference is, and I feel like were there recreation? I don't even know in that movie. Yeah, and I don't know what she did differently. You know, I mean, I guess there was a lot I felt like authentic film stock, and your film mixes mediums, right? In an interesting way, where you have the VHS camcorder, which initially you'd be like, this aesthetic is gross, and in your movie it turns it into this beauty, or like Capturing the Friedmans. I think in that case, it works to its advantage. It has a like snuffy quality to it. But yeah, I think, I don't know what the answer is. For me, Stories We Tell, I would say almost felt like I thought she was going into real footage. She did mix, yeah.
She didn't say that. It's interesting. I just was curious to see what you think about, the blurred lines of that.
I mean, just briefly, for me, I think what that does is it causes you to question. It's like what, and this is her search, for her family and for these stories and to come to terms with the truth. And so by blurring those lines, I think it heightens that sensibility in a really interesting and complicated way that I think it also invites multiple viewings. But I think it says something about the nature of documentary and where that's headed in terms of, blurring those lines, how to use, it as like a narrative strategy in a way.
I wonder, like for me with that film, and I don't know how many people have seen it, one thing that happened to me in watching it was I kind of fell out of the film because I started recognizing, wait, this is a recreation, whereas I was assuming it was all, archival footage. Did you think about that and when you were mixing your stuff together?
You mean in Elena?
Yes,
in my
in
own
Elena.
film? I think in Elena, the film is really patched together with tons and tons of home video footage. And there's something so intimate about that because it really feels like you're experiencing this family's memories. And then you have that contrasted with like this, very gorgeous footage shot on Reds and DSLRs, which is quite different, but it invites you in a very kind of specific way. And so it might look, rough, or it might look, it's messy. But because of that, it has like the feel that the artifice is let down. And I think that that's something that people have tended to respond to well in the film.
Well, I have to say, with Elena, that I didn't get pulled out of it, and I'm a big Sara fan, and that was just the only thing that sort of shocked me, but that's personal. In any case, the back.
Yeah, to tag on, Michael, the question about Susan Sarandon, two things without specific, cost.
I don't know if she'll read your script. No,
No, I'm not filming it. You don't have to worry about that. No interest. In order to be able to do it at your cost, did she say, oh yeah, I like this project and therefore I will do it without charging you what I would do?
Yes, she worked for, all of the actors worked for a really low budget SAG day rate. But she did sort of has points in the project. So that was sort of the way I think she justified it. But yeah, everyone was making, I don't even want to say a number, I don't even know if I know the number, but it was very low. But it was that understanding that she did have an investment in it beyond that. And I don't know, if there weren't points involved, if she would have agreed to do it. But again, you have to think about these actors, it's like 5 days out of their lives and you think it's like a bigger commitment. And if it's not a lead role and they can do it for a week, it's like even if you're working for a week for like $200 a day or something, it's like at least there's some money coming in. But yeah, everybody agreed to do it for the love of the movie and just sort of trusting that it would be fun for them. Did that help? Yeah, I would say we didn't, one way of saying it quickly is we didn't like have our financing 2 days later after Suzan signed on, but it made the project legitimate in a way that was invaluable, and it sort of, we did get the money ultimately. A lot of people invested on the Maryland element and the Ocean City element. There were a lot of people, it was like, for a 7-figure movie, we couldn't do a Kickstarter campaign because that would have been outrageous, but the way that the investment happened, my producer says that usually, he's an entertainment lawyer, and he's like, for $1 million-ish movies or $1.5 million movies, he said always, and he's worked on hundreds of them, and there's always at least half of the budget, one big check is written. And then the rest of it you sort of cobble together. And our movie, that was not the case. It was a lot of people buying shares and sort of strangers saying, we met someone at a Dunkin' Donuts on Coastal Highway in Ocean City. He's like, I want to invest $25,000 in your movie. It was like, and you want to meet at the Dunkin' Donuts to talk about this? Like, okay, I love Dunkin' Donuts. That's perfect. I'd prefer to do that, but it didn't seem like real Hollywood. But then also the city of Ocean City, Maryland, they have a tourism board, and this is like the miracle of just certain projects. You have to trust in it. They have an excess. They have a 2% sales tax rate in Maryland, in Ocean City, for tourism. And they invested, the county and the city each invested $100,000 in our weird independent movie because maybe they had 300,000, so they said, we'll give a third of it, and it would have been like a Bon Jovi laser light show instead. And they decided, well, this could be like advertising. It is a family-friendly film, sort of inherently. I didn't have to make any decisions ever based on them telling me what to do. They just sort of trusted that that was the project. And even just going to Sundance, and we had a party and had Ocean City on, I feel like they were, they feel rewarded, and I hope the movie, will do well. We're opening in June in Maryland and elsewhere, and I hope it'll catch on. But that's where it's just like, I would never mind, if I did the like senior week or beach week rated R version, I would not be asking the tourism board for $100,000.
I think we have time for one more. I saw one over here. Go ahead.
I was reading in the paper recently about liability and insurance for independent filmmakers, and I thought about the film festival and all these young students and kids that are trying to make films, and they were talking about the liabilities. I mean, how does that work? I mean, did you have to have huge insurance, or do you just do it? I mean,
You're strongly advised to have insurance. And there are special insurance companies that work with filmmakers, both documentary and fiction filmmakers. And so you can negotiate a rate and to cover your film. So we had insurance. I mean, I would imagine everyone playing at this festival probably had insurance.
About the young kids that put films into the film festival that are in middle school and stuff like that. I mean, they obviously can't afford to insure their films. And how valid is that statement that you have to have that now?
Well, I mean, on the level they're doing, you hope their parents are lawyers, I guess. I don't know.
I just thought it was weird. I mean, everybody videotapes everything now, puts it on YouTube, and I'm sure they're not insuring themselves doing it. So.
And there's some people can get themselves into some trouble sometimes, depending on it. Anyway, thank you all for being patient with our musical chairs, and thank our guests.